Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome. I'm so glad to have you along on this historical journey. This story is a continuation of the story that you learned about in your last U.S. history class. We begin this course with the nation healing from the Civil War, and as it heals, it grows in the size of its territory, the size of its economy, and the size of its population. The growth of technology is a catalyst to this progress. We begin with the first era or time period between 1877 and 1898. This is also known as the Gilded Age. Major events affected the North, the South, and the West simultaneously. Today we're going to begin with the settlement of the West and Native American relations in Lesson 1.1. After the Civil War, the area west of the Mississippi River is settled by miners, ranchers, and farmers. As we can see on our map here, the Mississippi River goes from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Great Lakes. This is a continuation of the belief in manifest destiny that has urged Americans west since before the American Revolution. As we can see by our map, the amount of farmland more than doubles in the second half of the 19th century between 1850 and 1900. In 1850, only 16% of land was farmland. But because of several factors that we're going to talk about later in this lesson, by 1900, farmland shoots up to 44% of the land in that area. Mining was the first industry to attract settlers to the West after the Civil War. Prior to that, gold had been discovered in California, Colorado, and Nevada. The most famous of these were the discoveries of the California Gold Rush in 1849. The Civil War brought sort of a pause, or so to speak, after the war. Many miners continued their westward migration by journeying to Alaska. The reason for this is it was seen as a really big, large, distance source of raw materials. While this is not exactly a get-rich-quick scheme, it was hard and really dangerous work. Some miners did find large deposits of gold and silver. The Comstock Lode mine near Leadville, Colorado is a really good example of this. In the nearly 30 years between the founding of the mine in 1859 and about 1880, $270 million worth of gold and $400 million worth of silver was extracted from that mine alone. The photo we can see here gives a really good visual example of this, as they've got bars of silver stacked almost as tall as the people. That's a lot of silver, guys. During this era, thousands of people, hoping to ease the woes of economic depression, sold farms, dropped businesses, and boarded ships to follow their dreams north, despite of the dangers that they sought as they got there. They just wanted to find gold and silver and other precious metals that would help ease their financial hardships. With the influx of settlers, though, mining towns also sprung up in many areas of the West. This helped to develop the areas as each town created a need for businesses and government, which would then in turn attract more settlers to the area, making the population go up as more and more people were attracted. As populations of the rapidly growing western cities increased, so did the demand for beef. Guys, these people need food. This led to a cattle boom in the region. A majority of the cattle ranches were located in the areas of Texas, and ranchers would drive cattle across the open range to the railroad towns farther north. Many of the ranches looked similar to this photograph. As we see here, the cattle were allowed to roam freely as opposed to being fenced during the height of the cattle drive years. The cattle drive process was long, taking about 3 months in total, but it was really profitable. They could buy cattle for about $4 per head in Texas, then drive them to the railroad towns such as Dodge City, where they could sell them for about $40 per head. So they could buy them for $4 per cow and sell them for $40. Let's just look at an example. Let's say you were a cowboy and you bought 1,000 head of cattle in Texas for $4. You've spent $4,000. You then drive the cattle to Dodge City and you sell all 1,000 at $40. That's a $36,000 profit. Of course, that's just an example, but it was very profitable for those willing to do it. Once those cattle were put on the train, they would be transported to the major meatpacking centers in Chicago and Omaha, and these cattle drives also contributed to huge boom towns, I guess you could call them, in the West. But cattle ranching faced some difficulties by the 1880s. More and more farmers were moving west and were not happy about cattle eating their crops as they moved to the railroad towns. So to prevent the damage to their crops, farmers began to use a new invention called barbed wire, which had become pretty popular by the time the cattle ranchers were coming through and was created in about the mid-1870s. By 1900, overgrazing, drought, and other issues left little grassland for the cattle to feed on, and by that point, the glory days of the cattle and the cowboy were over. In addition to the miners and ranchers, many of the migrants to the West were farmers. In 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, Congress passes the Homestead Act. This act offers 160 acres of free Western land to any person willing to claim that land for 5 years. Of course, you had to improve upon it, so you had to build a farm, for example, and then at the end of that 5 years, you had to get signatures from 2 other homesteaders to confirm that you did fulfill the requirements. If you could get those and you fulfilled the requirements, the land was yours. Hundreds of thousands of people thought this was a wonderful idea and moved to the Great Plains to create a new life. Here's our 44% of farmland by 1900. This was the main catalyst to that expansion of farmland. This is an archival photo of a homestead certificate that you would have received when you agreed to improve upon the land. It would have information specific to you, including the date and the location of the land office, your name, and the exact coordinates of the land that you had chosen. You would certainly want to keep this certificate, of course. Life on the Great Plains wasn't so easy for settlers. The land was much different from that they were used to in the East, and they had to learn how to farm with different techniques, such as dry farming, and some of the crops that they were used to did not always work well on the plains, so they had to start planting different crops as well. They also had to live in different shelters. We're going to stop and take a look at this photo really quickly. As you can see here, the building in the background is their house. That house is made out of sod or the top layer of the soil because they didn't have a lot of trees. Homesteaders built sod houses like these because of the lack of trees on the plains. It's pretty much open land. For this reason, they called them soddies because they were built out of sod. Natural disasters, though, were really dangerous as well, such as tornadoes and drought. These were not issues that they were used to from their eastern days. For this reason, unfortunately, 60% of homesteaders failed to make it the required 5 years. Those who were successful, however, transformed America into a major food exporter in future years. Some African Americans, known as Exodusters, also take advantage of the Homestead Act. Many of them were former slaves who were facing horrible discrimination in the Jim Crow era South and sought a new life in the West, similar to that of the other homesteaders. In 1869, miners, ranchers, and farmers were finally connected to the eastern city by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. In order to encourage the construction of these railroads, the federal government gave millions of acres of western land to the railroad companies. to give them space to create these railroads. They saw it as good for the economy and good for the nation to connect East and West. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in two separate sections. The Union Pacific was built from the east to the west, starting in Omaha and ending at Promontory Point, Utah, and it was built predominantly by Irish immigrants. The second section of the Transcontinental Railroad was built from west to east, beginning in Sacramento, California, and this was built predominantly by Chinese workers. The hiring of these immigrants was not uncommon, as the railroad companies could pay them a lesser wage for working in these extremely dangerous conditions. On May 10, 1869, the two tracks finally meet at Promontory Point, Utah, where they drive the Golden Spike, and the creation of this railroad cuts travel time from the East Coast to the West Coast from over 4 months to less than a week. By 1890, there are 5 railroads that extend to the Pacific Coast. So we are actually connected in multiple manners by 1890. The expansion of the railroad leads also to many innovations. Some of these include time zones, which allow for the train companies to coordinate schedules, as well as luxury train cars called Pullman Palace cars, which offered luxury travel, and refrigerated train cars, which are very helpful as we start to move food and crops and beef around the country, because this helps to keep the food better for longer and transport more efficiently. As the building of the railroads expand, Chinese workers were recruited to help complete the task. Many Americans became really unhappy about this. They felt the immigrants were taking their jobs in the West, and this leads eventually to the Chinese Exclusion Act being passed by Congress in 1882. This ends Chinese immigration to the United States, and this is not repealed until 1943. So take that in, guys. Passed in 1882 saying no Chinese immigrants can come in, and they're not allowed really back in until the repeal of this in 1943. By 1890, the migration of Americans into the Western territories left no unorganized territories. By the turn of the 20th century, the Western frontier is officially closed. The expansion of migration into the Western territories by the Gilded Age brought devastation to a lot of Native American tribes. By the end of the Civil War in 1865, 2/3 of all Americans lived on the Great Plains. Tribes such as the Sioux, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne were very dependent upon the prevalent buffalo and the horses that they could find there. The flood of miners, ranchers, and farmers during the Gilded Age violated many of these territories. This led to a series of violent conflicts known as the Indian Wars. By the late 1870s, the federal government began further dividing Native Americans through the Dawes Act. Now, this comes in two separate acts. The first one, in 1877, breaks up the previous land settlements and forced the tribes into smaller reservations that would allow more land for the settlers. In 1887, we see the second half of the Dawes Act, where Native Americans' traditional tribal ways were being threatened as they began to be forced to assimilate. Assimilate means to adapt to the common culture. So essentially what's happening is that these Native Americans are being forced to cut their hair and wear the clothing of a modern, at that time modern, American, and conform to American customs. At that point, much of Native American life was being taken away. under the Dawes Act. This ends lesson 1.1. See you back here later for lesson 1.2, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.